Hi, thank you. Right, I feel like the previous speaker, Jonathan, I've never actually met him before, but I feel like we're soulmates. So we're two Israelis having a go at trying to solve the same problems here. Actually, you'll see that even some of the slides are quite similar. But I'll take you through the journey we've been on and really how we've come to the conclusions that we've come to. So, Ben-Ari, I'm the founder and CEO of a company called APPII Blockchain, which I founded 3 years ago. We're essentially a blockchain development studio. So for 3 years, we've been working with clients and building solutions using blockchain technology. We were selected by Gartner in 2017 as one of only 4 small companies worldwide in their report of companies in the blockchain space. And we're actually in the 2018 report as well, which I don't think has come out yet. We've got a team of experts. I'll show you them in a minute. We're based in London, although I'm starting to feel almost half Dutch, and I'll show you why when we go through the client list. And inevitably, we start off, people come to us asking for blockchain solutions, but then they need to see the thing that's on the blockchain, and so we end up building applications with web interfaces, mobile apps, wallets, and so on. So we have a full stack development team. We're also, one of our customers, which is Shell, actually, we ran a competition which we won. We were awarded quite a substantial project with them, and they offered to invest. So Shell is actually an investor in the company, as is a London-based VC called Calibrate. So this is the team. As I said, they're all based in London, but we're starting to spend more and more time over here. And these are some of the clients we've been working with over those 3 years. Now, the interesting thing about the journey for us, apart from the fact that I think blockchain in general is super interesting, is that we have half our clients are startups and half the clients are corporates. And it's been a 50-50 split since day one. And that really gives us a very, very interesting perspective, because the corporates are coming to this, understanding how blockchain can support and evolve and potentially disrupt the business areas that they're in. And the startups, on the other hand, just want to disrupt the corporates. And they want to move really quickly, and they'll take big risks. And what we can see from the 2 different types of actors in this space actually provides a lot of learning to us in the types of solutions that we can then offer. So just looking through this list, and I'll go through some of the customers a bit later, but we've got some of the large banks on here, energy companies, the United Nations, some startups in things like invoice financing, legal smart contracts, IP registration, consumer personal data, all sorts of things. So I'll talk you through some in a bit more detail. But when we look at blockchain in general, if I had to say really 2 words that summarize why a company would look at blockchain in the first place, for me it's about group security. So when you have a distributed ledger and when you have these consensus mechanisms, what you're actually doing is you're saying that instead of having the data in one place where it's potentially more vulnerable to attack, you spread it through a group, and the group is really securing that data together. So if somebody's trying to compromise data would have to compromise a third or half of that group, depending on the consensus mechanism. So it really boils down to group security. And that's a really important thing to remember when you work your way through the use cases. So I mentioned Shell. Shell ran a competition, invited blockchain companies globally to build a solution in the trading space. We won the competition. As I said, they invested, and we're involved in a number of projects with the company now. We're also working now with Lloyd's Register, which is the registry of ships. So what's really interesting in the blockchain space is looking at assets. And we work with companies that are involved in assets in a different place in the life cycle. But actually, where it all starts, the asset creation and initial registration is really where the blockchain work can actually begin. And so Lloyd's Register is the registry of ships. As soon as a ship is built in the shipyard, it goes on there. And if you think about all the trade activity and everything else that happens afterwards, it's really all about this original asset. And so it's very interesting looking at a blockchain where that first resides. We're working with KLM, and we have some people here from the company. If anyone wants to talk about the project, you can talk to them directly. We're also working with SITA, which is a company owned by the airline industry. Working with them on a very, very interesting project around drones, drone registration, and specifically regulation around commercial drone flight activity. We've also been working with IBM through a startup accelerator in the mobility space called Rocket Space. Another example of an application, APPII, which is, I like to call this provenance of people. So it's where you studied and where you worked, and proof of that evidence, really when you go to your next employer, and allowing onboarding and recruitment to be a lot smoother, more reliable. Cygnetise, I love this company because they took a really simple problem and they haven't left it. They haven't lost focus or tried to boil the ocean. This is company signatory lists, which is who's allowed to sign what on behalf of a company. And that's all they do, but they do it in a super secure way that can be shared between companies to reduce fraud. So you don't get people leaving an organization and still signing some payments when they're not allowed to. Okay, so the subject of this presentation, I've really given you some background of where we've come from and why we think we can talk about this. So why build platform-agnostic solutions? And here this might look a bit like, a bit like Jonathan's slides. Originally we had Bitcoin, then came Ethereum adding smart contracts. Tendermint said, okay, smart contracts super interesting, but we'd like to make them private. Then Parity was basically a split in the Ethereum founders and another version of the Ethereum client. Then JP Morgan came along and said, well, Ethereum is great, but we'd like to add privacy. So they created Quorum. Consensus came along and brought together the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance because they thought that all these companies should be working together on an enterprise version of Ethereum. And then, of course, we've got Hyperledger, which you've heard a lot about today, and Hyperledger Fabric by IBM. Or is it open source IBM? Hyperledger Sawtooth, which is, again, another different blockchain under the Hyperledger umbrella from Intel. Another Hyperledger project, I'm not even sure what that one is. The banks came along and created Corda. Then Ripple came along and created, another Swift. Digital Asset Holdings, another blockchain solution more for capital markets. Chain, again, a blockchain solution for capital markets. Dash, a faster Bitcoin, I think. Stellar, another faster Bitcoin. Cosmos, let's bring all the blockchains together and create networks of networks. Polkadot, let's do that but not use Cosmos. Aeon, let's do that but not use either of the other two. Quant, let's create a layer over all of these blockchains so they can talk to each other. Plasma, I think this is bolting a sidechain onto a public blockchain, but I'm not quite sure. Raiden, this is a sidechain. Dragon Chain, I really don't know what this is, but somebody told me we should check it out. Neo, if you're going to do any work in China, for some reason it has to be on Neo. And EOS, I think this is really a private blockchain being called a public blockchain. BigChainDB, super fast, but is it decentralized? We're not sure. Hedera, apparently this one's really good, but it's closed, so I can't really tell you. And that's a tip of the iceberg, right? I think today we've had people come up here and talk about blockchain platforms which are not on that list. So the situation is really a bit out of control, and it doesn't really make any sense to me as a techie. Now, if you've decided that your business should actually has an opportunity here and could actually do something on blockchain, where do you start, and what do you actually use, and how do you decide what platform to work on? So one of the problems is that, as you can see from those all those logos that I showed you, the landscape's really evolving, and it's not just about lots of people having a go. It's about lots of different innovation happening out there and different attempts at consensus algorithms and so on. And we don't really know where this is going. So we don't know which platform will be around in the next few years or which one will dominate. One thing to think about, which Jonathan touched on, is that at the end of the day, this is a network technology. And that means that we have to work together, and you only really get value if you've got others on your network. And if we're all creating little networks in isolation, then we're not really going to get the value. We might feel that we're commercially protecting and creating a competitive solution in our industry, but actually we're not going to get the value of the technology. We're not going to have security through a group, as I showed earlier, and we're not going to get some of the efficiencies that we had earlier. So I think we need to think of it in terms of a network. And as I said earlier, we don't know which technologies will be around, so we might find that actually there's some really smart people in the room. They've created a fantastic new blockchain that's faster than everybody else and appears to be super secure, but who knows if they'll be around in a few years' time. And if you're investing now and building an application, you're building that on top, and you really want that to last. So we think a lot about how to future-proof your investment in blockchain technology. And my approach to this really comes from 20 years working as an enterprise architect, solution architect in enterprises. And what was drilled into me was to keep all of your solutions vendor and platform agnostic as much as you can, and really protect yourselves from being locked into a specific technology. And that's not something related to blockchain, it's just good IT architecture in general. And the way to do that usually, unfortunately, comes down to going with the lowest common denominator. So doing things in a way that you know is relatively compatible or won't require completely re-engineering your solution if you go from one technology platform to another. Now that means that you're not always making the most of the platform. It means that you're not always having the optimal solution. It's a compromise, but it's a compromise that allows you to future-proof your investment. And getting a little bit more technical, but not very much. So if we think about the stack of an application, so we've got the user interface at the top. We've got an application which sits on a server typically, which will be distributed. It may be distributed, it may even be centrally housed, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And then below that, we would put platform abstraction. So we would say that most of the stack above it, above the blockchain, doesn't really need to know or care which blockchain you're using. And that sounds simple, but it isn't that simple to implement. And that's because part of the blockchain solution has to sit with the user, and that's the keys. So we have to find a way of having the keys on top and having an application in between, and then having the abstraction to the underlying platform. So keys go with identity, which goes with privacy, which goes with anonymity. And these are requirements that we've seen across pretty much all the projects that we've worked on. And even if they're not requirements yet, they will be soon for each of those projects. So I guess the other thing to think about is that you might be developing a solution initially in your organization, but if it's going to be distributed, which it really needs to be for you to get that security as a group, then it's going to be distributed to a group. And that means that it needs to be something that can be deployed easily in someone else's environment. So we very much look at Docker and cloud and how this is going to be containerized and easily deployed into different environments. And the other thing to think about there is cloud vendors, because if you're producing something which is with one cloud vendor, then you're really forcing everybody else in your network onto the same platform. And they might come with their own preferred vendor or their own environment, which you would need to do that your ledger or the solution which you're trying to distribute, they would have to be able to adopt it. And then below that, we have the blockchains, and I've listed a few here. And the bit of the application that goes in the blockchain is the smart contract. And there are different ways of engineering the smart contract, again, using this kind of lowest common denominator approach, where you really keep things super simple. What you're doing in a smart contract, you can be quite confident you could do in a smart contract on a different platform. If you start going deep and using vendor-specific or platform-specific functionality, that's when you're tying yourself to a specific platform. So just to summarize, number one is to keep the contracts simple and generic. And number two, we think, is to handle keys, identity, privacy, and anonymity outside of the blockchain platform itself. Because if you do that, most of what you're building, you can actually be lifted and dropped onto something else. It could actually be dropped onto an Oracle database from our friend who spoke earlier, because the application wouldn't actually even necessarily be aware that it has to be a distributed ledger underneath. And I guess a bit like Jonathan, who presented the solution earlier, we've created an open layer, a thin layer, if you like, to provide that abstraction and to handle anonymity, data privacy, like the keys, so identity wallets, on mobile web or on a server if it's B2B. And we've done this in a blockchain agnostic way. And we've also done it in a way that supports GDPR. Because again, we're in Europe, most of our clients are, and this is absolutely a requirement that we have, again, on almost every solution that we work on. So this is an open framework, and we've designed it to be used with any underlying blockchain platform. But it's really to safeguard against being tied into that underlying platform. In the activity that we've done, actually, one client came to us and said, we would like to build a solution, but we really want to understand which of the platforms we should use. So can we pay you to build the platform once and get it working on two different underlying technology blockchain platforms? And we did this with Ethereum, with Hyperledger Fabric. And we were able to demonstrate that the application on top, following the architecture and the structure that I showed you earlier, actually worked on both platforms, and we had very similar versions of the smart contracts working on both. So this does actually work in practice, and they asked us, part of the work was really analyzing the difference between the platforms, performance, how complex they are to install, lots of other properties of the platforms themselves. And they're evolving over time, so it's quite difficult to what we did a year ago might not be relevant now. Finally, I'd like to speak about Furn. So Furn is a project which is a kind of product piece that we've started internally. And the idea with Furn was really looking at a lot of the projects that we build on and thinking, where are all these things going? So, as Jonathan said quite eloquently earlier, you've got the permissionless public blockchain and you've got the private blockchain. Now, people are doing this, we think, because of the group security, so to make the solutions more secure for their users and more tamper-proof, less open to fraud. You can't really go onto the public chain, we think, because for regulatory reasons, performance reasons, and cost reasons, in its current form. And when I say public chain, I'm talking about Ethereum. We can talk about all the other variations if anyone wants offline, but I'm really thinking about Ethereum. Then private networks, you can really use any of the platforms that I described earlier. So obviously Fabric, Ethereum, and so on. But most of the platforms that we build for both startups and corporates, they start off in one place, right? They start off with one organization. And it's actually very, very difficult as a company, as an organization, to take the thing out of the building. You built it, it's really built for your environment and so on. And actually commercially, politically, and for all sorts of reasons, it's quite difficult to start distributing it. And certainly to start distributing control of a database which is going to hold your customers' data. But if you don't do that, then actually you're not really using the technology to get any value out of it, because you have complete control of the ledgers, and therefore you could potentially defraud it. And if that's the position, then you might as well just use a regular database. So we're trying to think, how can we help companies to actually create a distributed private network? And how can we encourage that ecosystem? And that's really where we come up with Furn. And this is really early days, so it's quite experimental. But the idea we've come up with is having, on the one side, having companies like our customers who've come up with blockchain solutions. And they have these private networks that they would like to expand into an ecosystem of their counterparts. On the other side, we have, well, in the middle here, we have kind of a new economy of providers. So you could think of these as miners in the business and corporate world. So companies providing hosting nodes or providing API and Oracle services into these private blockchain environments. Now, these providers would be fully regulated and compliant with the corporate requirements or the business requirements. And that could be proven. So that pool would be a pool of identified providers, and they could be audited by the businesses and seen to be compliant. The trick is, and really what we've tried to do here is create a protocol which is above the private blockchain network, so it doesn't matter which technology you're using, this sits in the smart contract. But it automatically selects a subset of that pool for you to work with as your providers for your private network. Now, what we can do here, and again, we need to run this by our clients to see whether they're open to this, we can keep the ones that have been selected anonymous. So you might not know which ones are actually providing a service into you, but you'll have proof that they're part of a group where you've vetted the entire group. So you could onboard them all as suppliers, but actually only a subset, and you don't know which subset is providing the service to you. And we can provide cryptographic proof for that selection and that activity. And I think that gives us a kind of interesting paradigm here, where we could say you have proof of compliance on the one side, but you have decentralized control on the other, because it would be very difficult to defraud the system if you don't know who the other parties are. So that's a paradigm that we're thinking, and you have to bear with me on this, because this is really very, very new, and we're sort of experimenting with it. But that's the kind of direction that we're thinking about, how we can make these real distributed systems in the environments that the corporates have to work in and have to do business in. I'm not just talking about corporates, also any company which is really in a regulated business environment. And that's it.